$1. That was the price of a human soul in Prosperity, Nevada, on a blistering Tuesday in July. The coin, a heavy silver Morgan, felt slick with sweat in Silas Walker's palm. He hadn't come into the territorial clerk's office to buy a person. He'd come to file a water rights claim on his small patch of dust-bitten land, a place he'd hoped might finally be the end of his long and bloody road. But the world had a way of finding him, of dragging its ugliness right across his path. The office smelled of stale paper, cheap cigar smoke, and the sour tang of human desperation. Behind the counter, a clerk with a green eyeshade droned on, his pen scratching against a ledger. In the center of the room stood 2 men and a girl. One man, a beefy freight boss named Jeb Barton, held a length of rope tied loosely around the girl's wrist. The other was his sullen-faced lackey. Barton was arguing with the clerk, his voice a low, greasy rumble. "It's a simple transfer of contract, Miller. Her indenture papers are signed and sealed. She's mute, so there's no argument from her side. The buyer backed out, left me holding the note. I just need to offload the contract." "This ain't a mercantile, Jeb," the clerk said, not looking up. "This is a government office. I record deeds and issue licenses. I don't broker labor contracts." "Then make it a marriage license," Barton sneered, a cruel twist to his lips. "I'll sell her contract as a wife. Find some lonely prospector. $1. Hell, 50 cents. I just need her off my books before the end of the day." Silas watched from the corner where he'd been waiting. He'd seen men like Barton all across the West, men who dealt in flesh and misery as easily as they dealt in flour and nails. They were a breed of predator that thrived in the shadows of progress, feeding on the weak and the lost. But it was the girl who held his gaze. She was young, maybe 18. She wore a simple, high-collared dress of gray cloth, a cheongsam that looked out of place and worn thin from travel. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, her head slightly bowed. She was small, fine-boned, like a bird that had forgotten how to fly. But it was her eyes that stopped the air in Silas's lungs. When she lifted her head for a fleeting moment, her gaze swept the room, not with fear, but with a flat, chilling emptiness. It was the look of someone who had seen the bottom of the world and found nothing there worth holding on to. Silas had that same look in his own mirror most mornings. $1 it is, then," Barton said loudly, looking around the room, his eyes daring any man to step forward. "Any takers? Docile, hard worker, won't talk your ear off." His laughter was a wet, ugly sound. The office was silent. The other men waiting, a miner and a ranch hand, shuffled their feet and looked at the floorboards. This was not their business. It was just another sad, dirty transaction in a town built on them. But for Silas, something broke loose. It was a feeling he hadn't had in years, a hot, clean anger that burned away the weariness. He had spent a decade of his life taking coin to end lives. He knew what it was to put a price on a human being. He stepped forward. The floorboards creaked under his worn boots. Barton's eyes narrowed as he recognized the lean figure, the weathered face, the low-slung Colt that was as much a part of Silas Walker as his own hands. Silas was known in Prosperity, not as a troublemaker, but as a man who finished any trouble that found him. He walked to the counter and placed the silver dollar beside the clerk's inkwell. The coin rang with a clear, final sound that cut through the stuffy silence. "I'll take the contract," Silas said, his voice quiet but rough, like stones grinding together. He didn't look at Barton. He looked at the clerk. "Draw up the license." Barton blinked, a flicker of surprise followed by greedy satisfaction. "Well, look at that. The quiet man's got an itch. She's all yours, Walker." He untied the rope from the girl's wrist and tossed it aside. The gesture was one of a man discarding a tool he no longer needed. The girl didn't flinch. Her expression didn't change. The clerk, Miller, looked from Silas to the girl and back again, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Silas, are you certain? A marriage license is binding." "I'm certain," Silas said. "What's her name?" Barton snorted. "Don't have one. We just called her the China girl." Silas's jaw tightened. He looked at the girl. "I'll need a name for the paper." He spoke to her directly, his voice softer than anyone in the room had ever heard it. She looked at him, her dark eyes unreadable. She gave no sign. "Just write Lynn," Silas said to the clerk, pulling a name from the air. "Lynn Walker." The ceremony was a farce of civility. The clerk mumbled the legal words, his eyes fixed on his ledger. Silas said the required "I do" in a low monotone. Lynn remained silent, a ghost in a gray dress. When it was over, Miller pushed the signed certificate across the counter. Silas folded it and put it in his breast pocket. He was now a husband. She was now his wife. They were strangers, bound by $1 and a piece of paper. He turned to her. "Come on," he said, his voice gentle. He gestured toward the door. For the first time, a flicker of something moved in her eyes, a deep uncertainty. She took a tentative step, then another, following him out of the suffocating office and into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. The dust of the street swirled around their feet as they stood on the boardwalk, a gunslinger and his silent bride, with the whole of prosperity watching. The walk to the general store was the longest Silas had ever made. Every window seemed to have a face in it. Whispers followed them like horseflies. He was acutely aware of the small figure walking a pace behind him. She moved with a delicate, gliding step that seemed at odds with the rough-hewn timber of the boardwalk. He could feel the town's judgment like a physical weight. Silas Walker, the man who lived alone, the man who spoke to no one, had bought himself a wife. And not just any wife, but a Chinese girl, a creature seen as less than human by most of the townsfolk. He pushed open the door to the mercantile, a bell jingling overhead. The place smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and salt pork. He needed supplies, but his mind was a blank. What did she eat? What did she need? He had lived on jerky, beans, and bad coffee for so long he'd forgotten how to provide for another person. He started with the basics, a sack of flour, beans, rice, a slab of bacon. He paused by a bolt of blue calico cloth, the color of a twilight sky. He imagined it as a dress, something other than the sad gray garment she wore. He hesitated, then moved on. It was too soon for such things. He was paying the proprietor, a grim-faced man named Henderson, when the bell above the door jangled violently. Jeb Barton and his 2 men filled the doorway, blocking the afternoon light. Barton's face was flushed with whiskey and malice. "Enjoying the merchandise, Walker?" Barton's voice boomed in the small space. Silas didn't turn around. He calmly counted out his coins onto the counter. "She's my wife, Barton, not merchandise." "Wife?" Barton laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You paid $1 for her. That's a purchase in my book." He took a step closer. Lynn, who had been standing near a barrel of pickles, went utterly still. "Leave it be," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low warning. "I don't think so," Barton said, his eyes glinting. He lunged, not for Silas, but for Lynn, his thick hand reaching for her arm. "Maybe I want a refund." Silas moved with a speed that was deceptive in its economy. He didn't draw his gun. He simply pivoted, inserting his body between Barton and Lynn, his hand coming up to catch Barton's wrist in a grip of iron. Barton grunted in pain and surprise. The 2 men stood locked for a moment, a tableau of brute force against tempered steel. "I said," Silas repeated, his voice dangerously soft, "leave it be." It was then that the small, unexpected thing happened. As Barton struggled, one of his lackeys began to circle around, hoping to catch Silas from behind. He moved quietly, his hand reaching for the hilt of a knife tucked in his belt. No one saw him but Lynn. Her eyes, which had been wide and fixed on Barton, darted to the side. With a movement so subtle it was almost invisible, she shifted her weight and nudged a tall, precariously stacked pyramid of canned tomatoes with the toe of her cloth shoe. The cans came crashing down with a deafening clatter, rolling across the floorboards. The lackey, startled, jumped back and tripped over one, sprawling onto his back with a curse. The sound broke the tension. Silas used the distraction to twist Barton's arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees. The other man, seeing his partner on the floor and his boss subdued, lost his nerve and backed toward the door. Silas pushed Barton away from him. The big man scrambled to his feet, his face purple with rage and humiliation. "You have no idea what you've bought, Walker," Barton snarled, nursing his wrist. "She's not what you think. She's worth more to men far more dangerous than you. You just painted a target on your own back." He spat on the floor and stormed out of the store, his men scrambling after him. The mercantile was silent again, save for the sound of a few tomatoes slowly rolling to a stop. Henderson, the proprietor, stared with wide eyes. Silas ignored him. He turned to Lynn. She was standing exactly where she had been, her hands once again clasped before her. But her eyes met his, and for a split second he saw something new. Not emptiness. It was a spark of sharp, calculating intelligence. She had seen the threat, assessed it, and acted. She had helped him. He gathered his supplies, his mind racing with Barton's final words. He had thought he was saving a helpless victim from a petty brute, but Barton's threat suggested something more, a deeper and more dangerous game he had just stumbled into. He had bought more than a wife for $1. He had bought a mystery, and very likely, a war. The cabin was a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, a table, and 2 chairs. It was clean but stark, the home of a man who owned little and wanted less. Dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon sun slanting through the single window. Silas set the supplies on the table. The silence between them was vast and heavy. He didn't know the etiquette for this. He was a man more familiar with the cold language of iron and lead than with the gentle domesticity that was now his responsibility. He turned to her, gesturing toward the small cabin. "This is it," he said, feeling the inadequacy of the words. He pointed to the bed. "That's yours." He then pointed to a rolled-up blanket near the hearth. "I'll sleep there." Lynn watched him, her head tilted slightly. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first voluntary gesture she had offered, a silent acknowledgment. It felt like a monumental victory. He set about trying to make a meal, his hands so steady with a firearm, feeling large and clumsy as he fumbled with the skillet and the bacon. He managed to get a fire going, but soon the cabin was filled with the acrid smoke of burning pork. He cursed under his breath, waving a hand in the hazy air. Suddenly, a small hand was next to his, gently taking the fork from his grip. Lynn stepped past him to the fireplace. With deft, efficient movements, she scraped the charred meat into the flames, wiped the skillet clean with a rag, and laid out fresh strips of bacon. She moved with an unhurried grace, adding cornmeal and water to a bowl, her hands knowing their work. She didn't look at him, but her presence filled the small kitchen area, a quiet competence that was both reassuring and humbling. They ate in silence at the small table. The cornbread was light, the bacon cooked perfectly. Silas ate slowly, watching her. She ate with a delicate precision, her eyes on her plate. For For the first time since he'd seen her, she seemed less like a fragile ghost and more like a person. A person who was hungry, who was tired, and who knew how to survive. Later, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, Silas sat by the fire cleaning his Colt. It was a ritual, a meditation. The familiar way to the steel, the smell of the cleaning oil, the precise click of the cylinder spinning into place. It was the only language he was truly fluent in. He felt her approach before he saw her. She knelt on the hearthstones near him, the firelight casting a warm glow on her face. In her hand she held a piece of charcoal from the fire. She reached for a piece of scrap lumber he used for kindling, and in the flickering light she began to write. The characters were intricate, a cascade of brushstrokes completely alien to him. He watched, fascinated, as her hand flew across the wood. She filled the surface, then looked at him, her expression questioning. He shook his head. "I can't read it." A flicker of frustration crossed her face. She dropped the charcoal and took a new piece of wood. This time she didn't write. She drew. Her first drawing was a simple outline of a large ship on a vast ocean. Then she drew mountains, a familiar jagged peak that he recognized as the crest of the Sierra Nevadas. She drew a line from the ship, over the mountains, leading to a crude drawing of a railroad track. And on the track she drew a symbol, 2 interlocking rings, the mark of the Central Pacific Railroad. Silas stared at the drawing, the pieces clicking into place. Barton's words came back to him. "She's worth more to men far more dangerous than you." She wasn't some poor girl sold into indenture. Her journey was deliberate, sponsored. She was connected to the railroad. She then reached inside the collar of her gray dress and pulled out a thin cord. On it hung a small pendant of pale green jade, carved in the shape of a crane. It was a piece of exquisite quality, cool and smooth, an object of wealth and status. It was not the possession of a common laborer. The knock on the door was a hard, official rap that made them both jump. Silas was on his feet in an instant, the Colt back in his hand, its presence a cold, familiar comfort. "Silas Walker?" a voice called out. "Sheriff Cutler, open up." Silas motioned for Lynn to move away from the door behind the table. He lifted the bar and opened the door a crack. Sheriff Cutler stood on his porch, his face illuminated by a lantern. And just behind him, lurking in the shadows, was Jeb Barton, a smug, triumphant look on his face. "Evening, Sheriff," Silas said, his voice level. "Got a warrant here, Walker," Cutler said, holding up a piece of paper, "for the return of stolen property. That Chinese girl you married today, she's the property of the Central Pacific Railroad. Barton here is their contracted agent." "I have a marriage certificate signed by your own clerk," Silas said. "She's my wife, not property." "A certificate bought for $1 to cover a transaction for a runaway," Cutler countered, his voice hardening. "It won't stand. Now hand her over and we can all go home. This is company business, Walker. It's above your pay grade." Silas felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. This was it, the moment of choosing. He could give her to them. He could step aside, let the brutal machinery of power grind on, and return to his quiet, empty life. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But as he glanced back into the cabin, he saw Lynn. She was standing frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth, the jade pendant clutched in her fist. In her eyes, the emptiness was gone, replaced by a stark, pleading terror. She was no longer a mystery or a burden. She was a person, and they were going to destroy her. He looked back at the sheriff. He saw the greed in Cutler's eyes, the cruelty in Barton's smile. He had run from men like this his whole life, or worked for them. Not anymore. "She's not going anywhere," Silas said, his voice quiet but absolute. He let the door swing open wider, revealing the Colt in his hand, held loosely but ready. You want her, you'll have to come through me. The standoff lasted through the night. Cutler and Barton knew Silas's reputation. They weren't foolish enough to storm the cabin of a man who could shoot the eye out of a hawk at 50 yards. They settled in for a siege, confident that hunger and thirst would do their work for them. But Silas was a patient man, and he knew the land. More importantly, he had an ally. Inside the cabin, by the low light of a single candle, Lynn drew again. She drew the face of a man, an older Chinese man with a kind expression and a long, thin mustache. She pointed to the interlocking rings of the railroad symbol, then to the man. She was telling him who she was trying to reach. Her father. An engineer, a foreman, someone important. The kidnapping wasn't random. It was a targeted act. Barton was a simple bully, but he worked for someone who understood her value. Before dawn, while the air was still cool and gray, Silas slipped out the back window. He moved like a ghost through the sagebrush, circling wide around his own property. He made his way to town, not to the sheriff's office, but to the small telegraph station at the edge of the rail yard. The operator, a young man named Finn, owed Silas a favor after Silas had run off a gang of card sharps who'd cheated him out of a month's pay. Silas sent a simple message to the Central Pacific headquarters in Sacramento. It was a risk, a shot in the dark. Have daughter of engineer. Jade crane pendant, held by Barton in prosperity, awaiting instructions. He didn't sign his name. He just paid Finn with the last of his money and slipped back to the cabin before the sun was fully up. Then they waited. 3 months passed. The blistering heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn. The sagebrush turned a silvery gray, and the air held the clean, sharp scent of pine from the distant mountains. The cabin was no longer a stark shelter, but a home. A blue calico curtain, the same bolt of cloth Silas had hesitated over, now hung in the window. Outside, a small, thriving garden produced squash and hardy greens, tended by Lynn's patient hands. The siege had ended, not with a bang, but with a quiet, decisive action. 2 days after Silas sent the telegraph, 2 grim-faced men in city suits arrived on the train, flanked by railroad agents with rifles. They didn't speak to Sheriff Cutler. They went directly to Barton's freight office. No one saw what happened, but Barton, his men, and Sheriff Cutler were gone by nightfall. The town whispered that the railroad had its own way of handling its affairs, a form of justice that was swifter and more final than any territorial court. Silas had a new job. The railroad men had offered him a position as a guard for the telegraph and rail depot. The pay was steady, the work honest. For the first time in his life, he felt the solid ground of a future beneath his feet. He and Lynn had found a rhythm, a language that required no words. He learned that the slight furrow of her brow meant she was worried, that a quick touch to his arm meant she was grateful. She learned that his long silences by the fire were not anger, but peace, and that the calloused hands that could handle a gun with such deadly purpose could also be gentle when mending a fence or fixing a loose floorboard. She was learning to write in English, her careful letters filling a small slate he had bought for her. Flour, water, home. One evening he returned from work to find her at the table, a piece of smooth pine in front of her. She had been sketching with a piece of charcoal. It was a portrait of him. It wasn't perfect, the lines were a little shaky, but she had captured something in his eyes, a weariness mixed with a quiet strength that he recognized as his own soul. He looked at the drawing, then at her. The pride and shy affection on her face struck him with the force of a physical blow. Something loosened in his chest, a knot of old pain and loneliness he had carried for so long he had forgotten it was there. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a new, uncirculated silver dollar. It shone brightly in the lamplight. He walked over to her and gently placed it in her palm, closing her fingers around it. It was not a payment. It was a gift. The first coin that was truly hers, not a price tag for her life. She looked down at the coin, then up at him. Her lips parted. For a moment he thought she would smile, but she did something more. A sound, soft as a moth's wing, escaped her throat. It was rusty from disuse, fragile, yet clear as a bell in the quiet cabin. Silas. It was just his name, but in that single word he heard everything. It was a key turning in a lock, a seed sprouting in the desert, a promise of a life he never thought he deserved. He knew then that a person's worth was not the price they fetched at an auction, but the home they built in another's heart. And for the first time in a very long time, Silas Walker was home. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.